Welcome, everyone. My name is Troy Young, and I am the president of Hearst Digital Media, and it's wonderful to have you all in the Hearst Tower. Today, I'm honored to welcome you and everyone that's involved in the Foreign Policy Association and Chuck Todd. The Foreign Policy Association has been driving conversation and understanding of global affairs in the United States for a long time. As its president, Noel Latif, has said, harking back to its very beginnings, the Foreign Policy Association is inclusive and seeks to engage the public as a whole. The same can be said of Chuck Todd, NBC News political director since 2007, and moderator and managing editor of Meet the Press since 2014. Prior to taking the helm of Meet the Press, Chuck was NBC News chief White House correspondent as well as host of MSNBC's The Daily Rundown. He is also the editor of First Read, NBC's must-read guide to political news and trends in and around Washington, D.C. Chuck is a self-described political junkie who has earned a reputation as one of the most passionate journalists and sharpest analysts in American media. What I learned actually today is you're also decent at sort of amateur Jeopardy, which is good to see. How long ago was that, Chuck?
It was a couple years ago. It is the most important thing as far as my mother is concerned.
Right.
It was winning Jeopardy.
Right. So Chuck is one of Washington's foremost experts on political campaigns of all levels. In 2009, he co-authored the definitive election result analysis book for the 2008 presidential campaign, How Barack Obama Won. His second book, The Stranger, Barack Obama in the White House, was released in November of 2014. Tonight, he'll speak to us about President Obama, his years in the White House, and what comes next in the 2016 election. After years of covering the White House and Washington, D.C. politics, there could be no better candidate to do this. So it's my pleasure to introduce Chuck Todd.
My apologies for rearranging your evening a little bit. Thank you for your patience. There was a reason I needed to be on nightly news tonight, so we did what we had to do there. But it is. I also am more interesting after you've had a couple of cocktails. So when I heard the cocktail hour was going to be after, I was wait a minute. My apologies for being a little scatterbrained. I'll admit it. This has been you describe it, tough week, everything that we've been dealing with. It's hard to believe that it was a week ago tonight that it all sort of started imploding on us. And I've been at NBC 8 years, and it is only Tim's death was worse at the network. And it has that same feeling. There's this feeling of a little bit of that something died, someone died. And that's been the hard part of this for everybody. When somebody actually dies, there is this, you rally. And I think the hard, and we got to figure out how to rally as a news division. And I think we're going to do that. And we're going to, as I said to some staff earlier today, yesterday was bottom, and now we move, and now we move forward. Anybody is, you have these challenges and you move forward. I think Brian's going to move forward. I have to say, I think I'm really proud of the leadership of NBC, because this was easily the most challenging decision that is on your desk. CEO of NBC Universal, president of NBC News, president of the NBC News Group. And I thought they came up with an elegant solution that both showed compassion for Brian and at the same time stood up for the values of NBC. And that's the type of organization I want to work for, that you are going to get a second chance. You are going to have an opportunity to make things right, and Brian's going to do that. But at the same time, nobody's bigger. No individual is bigger bigger than the organization. So I thought I'd get that out of the way because I'm guessing it's probably on the top of your mind a little bit. But I thought I'd get that out of the way a little bit and share that. I think that Brian's a friend of mine, and I think it's hard. However hard you think it is, it's even harder. But he's a tough guy, and he knows what he's got to do. So let's talk about the timing is kind of perfect when we're what I'm supposed to be talking about to you guys, right? Which is sort of where we are. I have this feeling. I know I'm supposed to. Some of this was billed as talking about 2016 a little bit, and I'll start by just saying I'm of the mindset that I think it's very possible 2016 is a national security election, that it becomes a foreign policy. It's very possible it becomes a foreign policy election. We don't often have them. 2004 we had one, arguably. But for the most part, we usually don't. But if I do think national security is going to play a larger role in the debate and in the campaign than it appears to be right now. I think there'll be a number of reasons. Number one, what happened today? The president is asking for an authorization. That on one hand seems academic, right? If nothing happens, it's not as if he can't keep doing what he's doing. But it certainly is important for American democracy. I have to say, as sort of just as a citizen, I am relieved that we're going to get everybody on the record on this. It's really important to get everybody on the record. And I am glad this is happening at the start of a presidential campaign. Because isn't it going to be nice, since we really didn't have this debate in 1999 and 2000, we didn't know where any of the candidates stood on issues like this in a serious way. The debate that is going to take place in Congress is now going to get forced upon the presidential campaign, and this is healthy. These are a bunch of commanders-in-chief wannabes who are now going to be forced to, at least we get to find out what is, you don't like this war authorization, this authorization to use force. What don't you like about it? It will force a debate, and I think allow us to find out a little bit more about these guys. It is interesting to me that apparently you show off foreign policy credentials by traveling to London. I didn't know that that's how you did it. Okay, I guess 4 years ago we had the Israel caucus, right? I sort of called it that. It seemed like that was the thing to do. This year, I think Scott Walker's there today. We had Christie there last week. There's been, I think Rick Perry is gone. I mean, I think there's been 4 or 5 of these guys. I do think Hillary Clinton's the real front runner because the mayor of London decided to come here today to meet with her. So, she didn't have to go to London. London came to her, right? But look, I do think that foreign policy is going to be higher on the agenda than it's been in an open presidential race than maybe people would have thought even a year ago, partially because of what the president did today, partially because of Hillary Clinton and her time at the State Department. And I think that you were going to see that. But this is arguably, if the economy is if we believe the economy is on the road to at least on the road to growth and on the road to real growth and real recovery here across the country, while yes, we're going to hear a lot about income inequality, the real challenges are going to be is managing this chaos. And so I want to sort of bring you to, and I'll sort of how I wrote about Obama and foreign policy and his national security policy in my book. Because what was interesting about it, even for my own reporting, which also include my own observations, is that the longer we went, the more it was harder to truly understand what Obama was trying to do. I don't think there's an Obama doctrine. And I went into this searching for an Obama doctrine. And I think that there was a time that he wanted to have one. And I think events have just sort of consumed the idea of having a doctrine, per se. I mean, I do think this pivot to Asia is something that actually, in the long run, will be seen as one of his better successes, will be seen as something that was a necessary, but I also believe any American president at this point in time this was a necessary thing to be done. But when it comes to managing the Middle, I mean, he certainly had one idea of what he thought he was going to be able to do in the Middle East, and obviously it's something completely different. I think they had one idea on how they thought they were going to deal with Russia, and obviously it's completely different. So I don't think we're not going to look back on the Obama 8 years and say, this seemed to be his strategy in dealing here, and this seemed to be, I mean, in many ways, it's crisis management, and that's what it's been. One of the things that I do believe that seems to impact the president and impact his entire national security team is the promises he made. It's been interesting in watching these guys make decisions, because one thing, and you have to give the president credit, what he campaigned on is what he has been trying to do, and maybe to a fault, when it comes to foreign policy. He promised to get us out of Iraq. He promised to sort of try to deal with the quote-unquote good war in Afghanistan. And in many ways, I think when you see what feels like, when you see him tackle what they're trying to do with ISIS, which they say one thing, but the policy feels like containment rather than truly going, marshaling enough resources to truly destroy ISIS. It's that Iraq war promise in the background. He believes ultimately he was elected to get troops out of the Middle East, to get American troops and bring them home. That's what he believes, and to get us out of these wars. And yet, here he is, and I can tell you this is a pretty reluctant thing, which is why I think here he is, he's going to be handing a new war authorization of sorts, a new pledge, a new commitment to the next president, which was something that he was determined not to do. It was, and I think in many ways, the promise of getting out of Iraq, I do think clouds. I call it Iraq war syndrome a little bit. I think it does clouds. You say to yourself, and look, it's hard not to, but if it wasn't for the Iraq war, how would you be tackling ISIS? And of course, some of you may say, well, without the Iraq war, there'd be no ISIS, which Jim Baker sort of said on my show about 3 months ago. I say sort of said. He was about to go there. You watch, it was fascinating to watch. I hear he goes there in private, but I remember I asked them the question, you've been criticized, why didn't you go get Saddam at the time? And he said something like, didn't you, because we knew, look at everything that has happened since, type of thing. It was like he was almost ready to go there, but he's always been very, he won't criticize that in public, and he won't criticize the decision to go to war in public. So, but I do think the president is determined not to be leaving troops in the Middle East, fighting a war after 8 years of serving. And I think it certainly does impact decisions that they make on this front. But it was, when I say that the president's campaign promises, I think, drove a lot of decisions. So for instance, the Afghanistan, when he went through, and I spent a lot of time in my book on the Afghanistan decision, because I think that this was the most scarring experience of his first year as president, because it is not cliche to say literally he was handed three options on troop levels. Option 1 was 120,000, option 2 was 130,000, and option 3 was 140,000, which of course he said, that's not an option. Those aren't three options, that's one option. And he felt as if the entire time he was boxed in by the Pentagon, that every time he was asking for real alternatives, a counterterrorism strategy that Biden was pushing. And I'm pretty convinced that I don't know whether Biden believed in the small footprint counterterrorism strategy that he was advocating, but I know that he was there to offer this sort of alternative view in the large debate that was taking place. If you recall, and I'm sure you guys followed it very closely, that was 9 excruciating months of debate about the Afghanistan surge at the time. And the reason I spent a lot of time on it is because he came to it reluctantly. I think to this day he regrets it. I don't think he believes, he'll never say it. I've talked to people that are close to him. I said, are you convinced he believes the surge worked? And they will argue, yes, he believes the surge worked temporarily. And the question is, would Afghanistan be in the same place without it? And that's a question he can't answer, that he doesn't want to answer on that front. So the point is, that whole experience of Afghanistan and that decision-making process made him distrust the Pentagon, made him distrust many of his, because if you remember, there would be a leak here about, you had General McChrystal at the time. He would say shoot down Biden. This is before the whole Rolling Stone business. But he would shoot down a Biden idea during a Q&A in London. There was Mullen's testimony when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the time that sort of endorsed the McChrystal plan before the president even saw the McChrystal plan. There were all these moving parts that certainly looked like it was an orchestrated campaign to box the president into coming to the, you got to send 140,000 troops. By the way, remember what he ended up sending, 130,000 troops plus 10,000 from the coalition. So they ended up getting everything they wanted. But it was how it went about. It created distrust between the Pentagon. It created distrust a little bit, I think, between the national security team, the White House, the inside the White House national security team, and even the State Department, because Hillary and Gates were sort of joined at the hip on this decision, along with Mullen. And so the President Obama and his national security team felt as if they were pushed into this decision. Well, that's why he's on his fourth Secretary of Defense. That's why when you hear even John Kerry, you'll hear blind quotes attributed to him supposedly, or people close to him talking about how frustrating it is working with the White House. That situation went so poorly that it made the national security team in the White House more insular, and why there has been this feeling over the last 3 or 4 years that they are making way too many decisions and not sharing, not seeking enough outside input, not letting state be involved in the process enough, not letting, even Chuck Hagel, right? And Hagel was sort of, when he was nominated, many in the Pentagon assumed he was just there for somebody for the White House to push around. But even he didn't like the way he was being treated by the White House. But it all stems back from how the Afghanistan decision went, where it was this feeling as if the Pentagon forced its will on the president. Look, and if at the time the president boxed himself in, right? When he was trying to make the case, he was trying so hard not to sound like a dove. Yes, he was anti-Iraq war, not anti-war. And he called Iraq the dumb war, implying that there was a smart war. So that was Afghanistan. So they themselves knew that they sort of had boxed themselves in. But I do think I go through this history because all of it, I think, now colors the decisions that he's making now. I think he now has come to the conclusion that obviously it's a conclusion, frankly, that even Gates has come to, that the large military, the large troop movements aren't going to do anything. Counterterrorism, they'll never say the word containment, but in some form, there is a form of containment that this policy is at when you're doing whack-a-mole. You can do what you can to keep these guys on the run. You can do what you can to kill the leaders, but they don't seem to ever fully disappear. There was important advice the president got from Biden, actually. And it's interesting, by the way, the Biden-Obama relationship personally is very good. The president's staff is not the biggest Biden fan, per se, but the vice president and the president are much closer than I think than people realize. And Biden gave him this advice. This was really before the full rise of ISIS. That said, post-Arab, said, look, the Middle East it's 25 years at best before we could see some semblance of stability. They're going through this, whatever we want to call the Arab Spring. It's certainly not a spring anymore. You can't do anything about it. And he was telling him, and this is right at the beginning of the second term, if you want to make an impact long-term on American foreign policy, finish up the pivot to Asia and start focusing on Latin America. that's where you can have an impact. So if it, that is why they've stuck to their guns on obviously what they've done with Myanmar. He wanted to make the Cuba decision. I could argue as somebody who grew up in Miami, I'm always partial to seeing our presidents actually focus on Latin America. They always claim every one of them claims they're going to do more, and none of them ever do. And he hasn't done much beyond doing what he did in Cuba, though you could argue simply doing what he did on Cuba is going to change some of the some of America's reputation in Central and South America, to a point that that at least that's off the table, and you can start having, perhaps start rebuilding relationships down there in a better way. But his whole intention, I think, was to try to basically contain the Middle East. ISIS isn't allowing that to happen, obviously, and this is why we are where we are. And I think this is going to be the struggle of, it's going to be interesting. It's going to be one of the struggles, I think, of the president's legacy, because I don't think anybody in this room thought that when he got elected that the Middle East would be more unstable today than it was when he got into office. And the fact of the matter is, when he leaves office, the Middle East is going to be more unstable than when he entered. Is that his fault? I think that, I think some will make an argument that, oh, should he have left more troops in Iraq? Should he have fought that harder? Should he have, where would ISIS be today if he had followed through on the red line in Syria? I mean, there is some what-if scenarios. And then there's going to be plenty of other people that say, what would the Middle East look like today if we didn't have an Iraq war? So, that academic debate, I think, is not going to get solved in one presidential campaign or perhaps for a generation. But I do think it sets up what's going to be just a running mess. I mean, when you look at it, I'll say this, the reason they didn't go into Syria is the experience in Libya. He got talked into Libya, and then you realize when you did when we did what we did in Libya and went in there and overthrew them, we had nothing on the ground to sort of fill what was going to fill the vacuum there, to create space for some stability, to see if that at all Libya could stay a whole country. And so, because I think he realized Syria, if Libya was a mess, and that seemed quote unquote easy, which by the way I think is going to be something that Hillary Clinton's going to struggle have an answer. It's interesting that she owns the Libya decision in a way that the president has almost let her own that decision. She's embraced it at the time as sort of being, with her and Susan Rice being at a rare point where we're united on the same position, pushing for the intervention. And I certainly think that was among the many reasons why he pulled back on Syria. If we can't sort of get involved a little bit without then having responsibility for cleaning these countries up. So I think it's going to be a complicated legacy for him. I think it's been mostly crisis management. He will have some positives on the foreign policy front that are Myanmar and Cuba, perhaps. I think relations with China are better today than they were 8 years ago, and with much of, look what's happened in India. There is actually a lot of good news stories for him when it comes to all things Asia, but considering the mess that's in the Middle East, I think it's going to be something that it's going to be, at best, a complicated legacy, and at worst, maybe perhaps a negative legacy. Where are we right now in Eastern Europe? Now, this is one of those cases with what's been interesting on Ukraine. This is one of those rare cases where there's bipartisan agreement about arming Ukraine and giving them more arms. So there isn't a divide inside here domestically on this. But is this a slippery slope? If we arm them and they get slaughtered still, then what? Are we then responsible for doing more? And I think that that's a question that hasn't been asked. That's a question they don't want to have to answer yet. And it's certainly something that Europe, I think that's why Merkel and Hollande are so afraid of that decision, because I think they believe if you arm them and they still get slaughtered by Russia, then you're inevitably being drawn into what could be something that's much more of a hot war than a Cold War. So it's a mess, right? I know, I sit here and look at these and I'm like, and that's why I think that this is going to be, and this is good to transition to 2016 a little bit. Who in the Republican side of the aisle has remotely can claim to have the experience ready to handle what is going to be two incredibly complicated messes right at your doorstep from the very beginning? In a weird way, Iraq and Afghanistan, in hindsight, are going to seem easy compared to where things. I mean, I've talked to a bunch of folks about Russia who are so concerned that the economic collapse is turning Russia into Germany in the 1930s or 20s, that the nationalism, that he's going to be able to blame all of their woes on the West and create sort of, and galvanize and use the nationalistic, play the nationalistic card, as Kerry referred to it to me on Sunday, for something that's perhaps irrational decisions that Mr. Putin makes. That's going to be on the doorstep of the next president. Never mind managing the chaos of the Middle East. I look at this field, and that's why I think that Mitt Romney to me made a lot, before Jeb Bush got it, I understood why Romney had potentially a way into this race, because Republicans' biggest criticism of Obama when it comes to his preparation for the White House is inexperience, right? One-term senator, was in over his head when it comes to dealing with a Putin, all this stuff. So you're going to replace that with one-term senators Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, or how about a bunch of one-term Senator Rand Paul, or how about a bunch of governors who are just learning? They're literally reading Kissinger books to get up to speed. Nothing wrong with reading Kissinger books, but I mean, that's the, it's like, wow, that, to be commander-in-chief, I hope, first of all, if you're just reading them now, part of me thinks, if you were really into this, too bad you didn't read them 20 years ago, but that's apparently what Christie and Walker are doing. And, there isn't somebody that is going to, that right now I can't turn to and say, well, that's not true. I think Lindsey Graham has a vision. I think it's a very aggressive vision. I don't think, obviously, he's not. I believe his candidacy is all about destroying Rand Paul. I think Rand Paul has a foreign policy vision that is one that is not going to, that is not going to play well inside the Republican Party. But when you look at the most likely nominees, and I think it's, if I were to give a final four right now, my gut would be Jeb Bush, Rand Paul, Mike Huckabee, Scott Walker. People can make cases for other candidates, but if I could have all four, if I could make a bet in Vegas, right, or I guess you go to the track and box all four of those in or something. I'm not a big horse better. Do I have it right? Is there any horse people here? If I could box those four, none of them scream foreign policy expert on this front. And obviously Jeb has the added problem of his brother's foreign policy is not popular. So the brand is a mess. And I don't know if just trotting, when Bush was sort of proving his foreign policy bona fides in 1999 and 2000, trotting out Dick Cheney, trotting out Condoleezza Rice, trotting out Colin Powell were positives. I don't know if Jeb Bush can be trotting out Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell even. I mean, I don't think it has the same. If anything, it could have a negative impact. So I don't know how Jeb's foreign policy plays. And then there's Hillary Clinton, who again, I don't, you look at the president's numbers on foreign policy are as low as they've ever been. His numbers on foreign policy are actually lower now than at than his economic numbers have ever been. His foreign policy approval rating, I think in our last poll, was at 33%. And it's, look, people, it's funny about what he's advocating, people support, right? We don't want a lot of ground troops. We don't want to get involved. But what the public doesn't want is uncertainty, right? The public wants that paternal aspect when it comes to foreign policy. Just keep this stuff away from us. Make sure, I hate to say it, but that's really where, so they're, which is probably why it'll be a cheap debate, the foreign policy debate inside the presidential, because ultimately the Republicans, most of them will probably just try to say, you know what, we're going to take the fight to them so they don't bring the fight here, and that'll be the extent of their foreign policy doctrines, right? And that might be enough to satisfy voters. That sadly could be enough. I'm kind of hoping it's not. I kind of think because of the chaos that's around that, a lot of us in the media are going to force more depth, a larger conversation, and force these folks to sort of prove whether they really understand the situations that they're dealing with. Because I think it's just, it is, I think it's what's going to dominate the next 18 months in one form or another, especially with the economy now starting to what appears to be on a steady glide path. So let me stop there and we'll do, I guess, open it up. I think we were going to try to do some Q&A. Open it up from there, and if you want to go more into the presidential race, I'm happy to do that. But I thought, considering you're the Foreign Policy Association, I kept my remarks more to foreign policy and what I've done. And I hope you don't ask me too many questions about NBC. So I'll leave it there. So where do you want to begin? Yes, ma'am, in the middle, right there.
What would you say was Hillary Clinton's biggest success as Secretary of State?
Well, how about this? I will tell you what she will use as her biggest success, and it would be Myanmar. That is, what's that? I know. No, I'm just telling you that's what that's one of what they believe. And look, I think short term, I think you have to say, I think she would have said Libya was a success in the moment. Look, the last thing she did as Secretary of State, I think she deserves some credit for, the ceasefire. The Gaza ceasefire, if you remember at the time, this is in 12, and this is when we had an uncertain ally, we had an uncertain president when Morsi was still president of Egypt, and she had to do old-fashioned shuttle diplomacy between Cairo and Jerusalem and getting the ceasefire negotiated, that first one. It's in hindsight, it doesn't look like a big success, but, it's funny about her tenure at State. And I had people, I go through this a little bit in the book. She spent I had people very close to her who admitted to me, she definitely felt she was not prepared to be Secretary of State. She didn't feel, and this is, meaning she just didn't know, she didn't have the depth of knowledge, say, that John Kerry does. No, this is not at the time. She wasn't chairman of foreign relations for 10 years, off and on, things like that. Hadn't done, despite what the president, she certainly had more experience meeting with world leaders than Obama did in 2008. But I had somebody close to me say to, and this is the way she is, she didn't feel as prepared for the job as she thinks she should be. So she spent the first 10 months almost on her own version of studying, of doing the crash course, of getting, and it was, as someone said to me, it was somewhere toward the end of 2009 that she started feeling comfortable in the job and started feeling as if she totally was on top of everything. And I think that goes to more of the type of her personality, right? She very much is sort of more of a studious. She's not Bill, She wants to be prepared. I always equated it. I'm guessing she clearly was the note taker in classes, right? Bill was probably not, but somehow could just listen. He was flirting, and at the same time, all this stuff was getting in his ear. Somehow he was consuming all of this data. But I think the thing that that is going to, and it's, I think, one of her great challenges, and I saw it covering her at state through the prism of the White House, is she's just incredibly risk averse. It's what cost her the presidential primary. It's what cost her the presidential nomination in '08. Just her nature is risk averse. And so it was always, I mean, wherever Gates was, she was. You know, that was the safe, you know, if you think about the first, when she was in the Senate, you know, even on the right, whatever the center position she thought was at the time is where she went when it came to national security issues. She wanted to be a little more pro-Pentagon than your average Democrat, right? And I think some of that, I had one person close to her say some of that had to do with she never wanted the idea that she never wanted her gender used against her and not being, quote, tough enough on defense. So I had somebody speculate that may be why she always seemed to be one of the, she'd be the more hawkish sometimes than Gates in the room when they were advocating positions. But I don't think she can sit here and say this is a great success. I mean, when I point to Myanmar and they point to it, and by the way, don't bring a Myanmar to a Jim Webb, who believes that he deserves a lot more credit for Myanmar than she does. But that's a longer, more personal story, but it may tell you why, among the reasons why Webb is kind of interested in at least announcing that he's challenging her in a primary. Whether he actually does the work to challenge her in a primary is another story. But I think that's going to be one of her struggles. But I think I think she can mitigate it a little bit in trying to explain what you just said. What's your big success? What is it about your tenure at state that we should say is going to tell us about how you're going to conduct foreign policy as president? I think it's going to be a hard question for her to answer. She's helped by the lack of experience on the Republican side of the aisle on this stuff. You keep shaking your head. You seem like you're you agree with the answer, but you're disappointed.
No. You said what I was thinking.
Oh, well, I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am, in front, yeah.
You started by saying you didn't think Obama had a set of principles or a doctrine.
I don't think it was a doctrine. Principles are not, I mean, I do think he's got principles, but when I say a doctrine, sort of like and I think,
Yeah.
yes, go ahead.
Okay, so the question is, what would be a set of principles or doctrine capable of getting beyond crisis management given what's happening in Russia, what's happening in the Middle East? Can you enunciate some?
I guess I would say I think we need to make a decision on how we're going to handle Russia. Is it a containment policy like the Cold War? Is it what's going to be look, I think when I say he doesn't have a doctrine, I think for the most part, he wants to always have a consensus when making decisions. He doesn't want America to ever go it alone. And I think he believes that was part of his messaging in '08, and that ultimately that is certainly an organizing principle in any decision he makes, right? When dealing with Iran, it was important to always have the P5+1, everybody singing on one note. Ditto with the Russian sanctions. But you bring up a fair point. It's sort of like, well, he doesn't have one. What would be one? Well, I guess you could. Bush had one, and it got us into trouble because he followed it too much, right? It was a democracy agenda, and so I do think the president hasn't articulated what's more important, stability or democracy in the Middle East, and I think that I thought that candidate Obama was going to be a stability first guy. That he was trying to basically say, I'm going to have a Bush 41 style of foreign policy, stability first, and but I think but then it was interesting to watch him during the Arab Spring because he certainly got caught up in the democracy movements, and it's why he pushed Mubarak, and why, by the way, it's interesting in the Mubarak decision. And by the way, I think he has since regretted it. This is what I mean when he was I think, campaigned as sort of stability first when it comes to the Middle East, even if it means supporting some authoritarian regimes. And then the Arab Spring happened, and I think he got caught up in the democracy movement, and this, not dissimilar to Bush a little bit. And then it went horribly wrong, and then he has since quasi in a stability. But I think that ultimately, I think going forward, we've got to probably base these decisions on are we going with a stability first? Are we going to try to build up these democracies? Are we going to get involved? And I think that that's something that the president decided was obviously couldn't be done. You tried it in Egypt, it didn't work. And because it didn't work in Egypt, he sort of backed off. But you are asking a fair question that I can't answer. And I'd be curious if someone in here can answer it, because I think that it's largely missing. And you know, this goes to the, you know, do we live at a time where you can't sort of, we can't impose our will? Even as late as the early 90s, we could impose our will. You know, Baker could bribe countries to be on our side. Well, even in these countries that are semi-authoritarian, you can't get away with essentially bribery. You know, us buying off a country and buying off support. So if we can't do that anymore, then can you even articulate a vision because you can't implement it? And I think that this is governing in the 21st century, and it makes it that much harder. Let me go back here. Yep.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Well, go you and you. That's all right.
You touched on one word there, Iran, and I was thinking of this. We have Netanyahu coming next month.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see that playing out in Congress? And our involvement in the elections in Israel, and then Iran after that, in terms of the clear desire of the administration to have a...
They want a deal.
with Iran.
No, and this is where I go back, where I feel like one of the more intriguing things about President Obama is he is determined to follow through on every campaign promise he made. And when it comes to Iran, remember in that infamous debate where he said he would have no problem negotiating with them if necessary, those regimes, and he took a bunch of heat at the time. But there is almost this, you know, I told you I was going to do this, and I'm going to prove that I'm going to do this aspect. I get the sense that there is a split inside the administration on whether to do a deal or not, and I think that I think Kerry's in one place, and I think I think Kerry and Biden are in one place, and I think the president's in another on an Iran deal. I know that that's never really come out, but I've certainly talked to Israeli sources that seem to imply that. Put it this way, they're much more satisfied with answers they get from Kerry than they do from inside the West Wing when it comes to how the negotiations going, where's this headed. It's interesting on the Netanyahu front. Boehner did to the Israelis what Boehner's done in negotiations with the president before. I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out how did this invitation happen and why did the Israelis not get guarantees that the Democrats were truly on board, get guarantees that there was going to be a process by which the administration, because they will acknowledge that they certainly didn't want it to play out the way they wanted this speech. They did want that. They didn't want to be used as a political football the way they believe they've been used. They've been very careful not to say it too often, but Boehner they didn't know that Boehner was going to go public with it the day after the State of the Union. I believe the Israelis when they say they wanted it 3 or 4 days later, it announced. Boehner had promised him there was bipartisan support for this invitation and for this speech. So I think the Israelis naively believed Boehner on that, because they knew they had bipartisan support in skepticism on the Iran deal. So but in hindsight, they found out he really hadn't secured, and Boehner used to do this in negotiations during the debt ceiling crisis, and during where he would tell the president, yeah, I think I can do this, this, and this. Then he'd go back, check, and say, whoa, I can't do it, and back out. And this has happened a couple of times on various issues, most of them on domestic disputes. And essentially, Boehner did this to the Israelis. So while I still think this is highly unusual, highly against protocol, and I think that there's certainly an alpha male standoff now between Obama and Netanyahu. Look, this is a terrible relationship. Personally, my standard line is literally Obama's from Mars, Netanyahu's from Venus. They really ought to read this relationship book, and see if they can. But they just don't see the world the same at all. And Obama's not been very. Neither Obama and Netanyahu are very diplomatic in their language with each other, so it's a pretty raw relationship. But I'm pretty convinced the Israelis realize this is not. They don't regret the decision to want to speak in front of Congress, but they know it's bad that it looks like they basically totally did an end around and participated in a political hit on the president. Because Boehner, it was right after the State of the Union, and the day after the State of the Union, and it was sort of a little bit of a stick, he knew it would be a stick in the eye. So, look, Netanyahu's going to come. I think, maybe I'm wrong, and I've talked to other folks in the Israeli side of things, I think he will not I think he will be, I don't think he will get specific on the deal. I think he will talk about the threat. I think he will try to be more of a unifying voice when he speaks to Congress. He may get more political at AIPAC because they're doing this at the same time. But I think that he will at least try to have sort of a different tone in front of Congress. Because I can tell you this, the ambassador, Ron Dermer, I don't think he's met, I think he's trying to he's been meeting with only Democrats now the last 2 weeks since this whole mess happened. I think they are in total, the last thing they want is for Israel to become a divisive political issue inside American politics. And I have to tell you, and I'm going to say this as an American Jew, I'm sick to my stomach about it. I am sick that somehow Israel has become a partisan issue, and it just, and there are a lot of Democratic members of Congress, Jewish Democratic members of Congress, that are absolutely sick to their stomach over it. And look, different people blame different, Netanyahu doesn't exactly have a bedside manner. So we'll see. By the way, as for I was expecting, and I do think Netanyahu's folks expect Isaac Herzog to be invited to AIPAC. And in some ways, I hear quietly that they kind of hope AIPAC does that, so that you present, remember, AIPAC is about Israel, not about Likud. AIPAC is, that it's about Israel's security, supporting Israel, not supporting one party over the other. So I guess I'm a little bit optimistic that at least the political mess will be mitigated in March a little bit. As for the deal itself, Congress, the pressure that congressional Democrats put on the president, I think has worked. I think it's interesting that now you have a pledge, you're not going to have an extension of the temporary deal. They're either going to have a deal or they're not going to have a deal. And so, whether the president wants to be upset at how congressional Democrats went about, how Menendez and these guys went about adding the pressure, it had the desired effect. And if you talk to some in the administration, some of this feels as if it's good cop, bad cop. They don't mind, there's some that don't mind this, having it out here as sort of added pressure to see if they can come to a deal, to get the Iranians to come to something that maybe they can sell. I'm more pessimistic, or whatever you want to. I don't know where you guys are on this, so I'm not going to pretend. I don't think a deal's going to happen. I don't. I think that there's going to be. 3 months ago, I was determined that literally Obama wanted a deal. I think now that he's becoming more skeptical all the time. I don't think it's just rhetoric. You know, his rhetoric has been skeptical. I think they feel as if the Iranians are buying time. We'll see how they react to this. What is now, you had Kerry say it, and then you had the president himself say it, no extension of the temporary deal. That being off the table, does that bring the Iranians into a different place? And I think we'll find out in a couple weeks. Let me go down here. I know I owe you, and I'm sorry.
Given the realities of the economics behind the press these days and media in general,
Yes.
and the long tail in terms of the Middle East situation, the 24-hour news cycle sort of appetite you guys have to satiate, do you think the press is in a position, especially in the specter of what led up to the Iraq war, to carry out its mission, to try and demand of our political leaders the sort of questioning based on this authorization that you talked about in your remarks?
I hope so. I mean, I'd like to think we are. I think we are for the Washington debate. The problem we have is we don't have the resources to cover the world the way we used to. You know, we don't have bureaus anymore. We call them fixers. We have a person in Paris. When I go there for a story, they're there. They're my fixer. They go find, you know, or I go to, and we have a fixer in Amman, and we have a fixer in Riyadh, and we have there's a time that we had bureaus, right? You know, there's a time that, and a bureau was more than one person. Now these people are freelance. They probably work for, a couple of them work for multiple news organizations. Maybe we're the only American news organization, but they're also the fixer for the CBC or the fixer for, you know, a Japanese television station. And it's sort of how this is happening. So my concern is that we are not going to be, we are really good, we know how to move on a story that's happening in a moment, and we will put a bunch of resources for the moment. My concern is that we are not devoting the long-term resources that you need sometimes to get a story right, to understand what's happening inside it. You know, take Turkey. I don't think we don't have, Turkey's arguably among the more important pieces of the puzzle for U.S. interests when it comes to dealing with the chaos that's going on in the Middle East. Turkey is an incredibly important player, and yet we have done a terrible job in the press reporting the complexities of Turkey's politics a little bit that we all need to understand better. This guy, Erdogan, is borderline dictator. Maybe he's a full-fledged dictator. I don't think we know. But we don't devote the resources to have that kind of reporting so that when something blows up in a country like Turkey, or even take Yemen. Yemen has been arguably the most, this is the country where more potential attacks in the United States have emanated from, at least as far as planning purposes. I don't have anybody there in Yemen. We have a guy, a fixer, in Sana'a, we regularly make sure that Richard Engel's visa doesn't expire, okay, so he can get in and out of the country, so that on TV we can tell you we're reporting from Yemen. No, and this is, trust me, Richard would live in Yemen if we would give him the resources to do that. But that's not, it's not, and I don't ever want this to reflect on our journalists. I mean, Richard is, he's our chief foreign correspondent. It's one thing to have a chief White House correspondent who's just there to cover the White House. We're asking him cover the world. And it really is sort of like cover all of these wars. So, and by the way, we're devoting more resources to it than our competitors. So I kind of hope we reorient ourselves a little bit. I don't, I thought maybe the Arab Spring would do that for us because there was so much happening and there was some interest. I mean, part of it is we're such a business now, and at the end of the day, Americans don't want to hear about foreign policy. I mean, I had an executive say to me that they thought I had too much foreign policy on Meet the Press last weekend. I had Kerry, and then I had McFaul to talk a little Russia. And I actually was also going to have the Turkish the Jordanian foreign minister, and then he got mad when he found out he was only going to get, that he was going to be after Kerry or whatever. He canceled on us. But I was going to have 30 minutes devoted, and it was like some of the executives were nervous about it. Not because they don't think it's important, but because they think viewers aren't interested. And look, there's plenty of proof that there's some truth to that, and that concerns me about the presidential campaign. But sometimes the explosions will force an issue. So I do think these presidential candidates are going to get vetted on foreign policy in a way that we haven't had them vetted in a while, and I think that that's healthy and that's good, because the issues of the day demand it. So I'm going to play optimist on that front. Let me go back here. I promised him back there.
Hi. As a fellow American Jew, I'm as distressed about this whole Netanyahu and Congress situation as you are. But that aside, I'm curious to hear, do you think Netanyahu's concerns about what the outlines of a deal look like they might be, if there is a deal, do you think that they're legitimate, or is this really a political ploy by him for the election? And also,
I have to say, I've spent a lot of time with these guys recently on his side and I don't want, in various briefings that I've gotten or various off the records that I've done with them and do my own reporting. I do feel like this is a political ploy. I'll be honest. I mean, I think that, and I even, even as this one person was outlining the concerns they had with the actual deal, they don't like that it has a sunset clause that might be 10 to 15 years rather than 25. They want a Hong Kong sunset clause, as they put it, right? They want it to be 99 years before the deal would expire. But they'd accept 25. I think it's 10 to 15 appears to be what is, and they don't like that. But at the same time, then they also will separately, when I'll ask about the election, how's it going? Well, obviously, the more that security is in the news, the better it is for Netanyahu. And Likud in general. He's more vulnerable when the talk is about the economy, when the talk is about the fact that, it is, it's interesting. If it wasn't for security concerns in Israel, that would be a non-functioning government on domestic policy. I even had folks in Netanyahu who says that this is just the various coalitions that they've had to put together to survive. And that, look, Netanyahu, to me, his great legacy is going to be probably the most effective Israeli politician at surviving, because, I think we all thought Ariel Sharon was the king of this, right? But Netanyahu's taken it to another level. But he's not created functioning domestic government. If it was ever a domestic-only election, I think he'd be done. So they do believe that security, any missile from Hezbollah that shows up 2 weeks before the election is a good day for Likud. So, so I do think there's a political element to this. But there is a disagreement, when it comes to the Iran deal, which is leaving them any ability, essentially, to enrich uranium. They just, there's two different fundamental views of what's a nuclear program and what's not. And I think one of Israel's concerns that to me rings true is, hey, we didn't know about, neither the CIA nor Mossad knew about one of their secret nuclear facilities until it was, and we found out later how much farther along that they were. And now we expect we're going to be able to keep track of this, you know, and continue to hope that they always stay a year away. I see why I think it's a legitimate skepticism on their part. And the fact of the matter is, if Iran gets nukes, the Saudis are going to go get them. Some might argue the Saudis might already have them. I've always wondered, like what we're supposed to say about the non-existent Israeli nuclear program? That maybe there might be one buried in the desert in Saudi Arabia that we don't know about. Would it shock anybody in this room? Right? So, but you could see how it could, I mean, it is, so that's why I think that it's possible that I'm back on, and I waffle a lot on which way if there's going to be a deal or not, but it's of late I feel as if that at least the U.S. posture of right now of being more skeptical of coming to an agreement. It seems to be where we are, at least right now. Yes, ma'am.
For those of us who voted for Obama twice, there are many, many who want. There's a great disappointment, even though we voted for him. What do you think the main reason that people that actually voted for him are so skeptical about him or his presidency overall? I know that's a hard thing, but the main reason.
Well, I think it has to do with he's just terrible at practicing the art of politics. That there is the book I wrote, I wrote through the prism of Washington, and which is why some people that were critical of it were critical because they thought you wrote it through the prism of Washington. But that was the whole point. He was brought in to run Washington. He was brought in to change Washington, and he chose not to. I think there's a couple things about him that the public thought he was, and it turned out he wasn't, right? Which is he's a much more cautious guy than the 2008 campaign seemed to let on. So I think there's something there. He turned out to be a terrible negotiator. He is, and I say this in that he's very rational about the sort of silliness of politics, but he's so rational about the silliness of politics that he's just as cynical about it as the public. And he lets that cynicism show in dealing with 535 people who do believe they're more important than maybe they really are. And he doesn't know how to fake it. I really think that this is like some of these little issues. I mean, and this is where it's funny, you know, when the conventional wisdom that, governors make better executives, at least some parts of presidents, that there's this idea. I do think one of the inexperiences he had was just sort of managing a legislature. Okay, he was in one, but he was in one to sort of stir the pot sometimes, and he'd cause some trouble. He wasn't ever corralling votes. There's something about a governor when you have to deal with the state representative Schmengi, who causes you so many problems in Hope, Arkansas, and you know Governor Clinton figured out how to deal with that idiot, and there's the equivalent of that idiot that you have to deal with in Congress sometimes. I do think that lack of experience for the president, for then candidate Obama going in as president, I think that has shown in his, I would argue, inability to run Washington. I mean, I think that's all. And I guess to get at your question, because it's the question you get from a lot of like Obama supporters, and they sit there and they like, why? You know, I'd like to think, I'm hoping my book helps explain it a little bit, but it is that I think he didn't have the presidency he thought he was going to have. You know, I think it's possible this is a different, you know, if September 15th, 2008 doesn't happen, and he doesn't have his first 6 months dictated to him of what he was going to do, does he get to set his own agenda in a way? Does he get to set some own precedents? Does he get to sort of have the presidency that he wants to have, rather than the one that was sort of thrown at him with an economic crisis? unlike any that we've seen in the modern era since the Depression. So you have to empathize on that point, right? The presidency he thought he was going to have when he announced on February 10th, 2007 to September 14th, 2008, the one he was campaigning for, the one that he was addressing, the change you can believe in, totally got thrown away in his, what he wanted to do. And I do think, by the way, the presidency that he's thought he was going to have, or maybe how things that he would have done, perhaps he's trying to do that now. You sort of see the catch up a little bit. But I guess I would go to answer, to try to get it, I think it's he is too cynical about Washington. He was too cynical about, and he doesn't understand like why a politician needs some love. He doesn't understand that I think presidents have to go, this idea of bipartisanship, and let's say, and I'll criticize the White House, and Valerie Jarrett will email me, do you know how many times we've invited them to Super Bowl parties? Or do you know how many times? And I'm like, it's not about inviting them to Super Bowl parties. It's about, and not to like use the LBJ metaphor, which of course I know it drives the Obama people crazy, but Lamar Alexander told me this great story one time, and Lamar was I think an intern for Everett Dirksen before he worked for Baker, and then he ended up, and he said, there's a great story that Dirksen would tell. So LBJ calls him up and says, asks Dirksen to come down and have a drink at the White House, and he says, I can't do it tonight. I got to go home. 10 minutes later, President Lyndon Johnson is in Dirksen's office. Let's have the drink in your office. Can you imagine Barack Obama going into Mitch McConnell's office? Ever. And here's the thing. Why hasn't he even tried once? I mean, just borrow an Aaron Sorkin script for 10 days and see what happens on how to handle Congress. And I think that ultimately I look at it, I just feel as if this is a guy that's never tried hard enough. And I think when you're a president, it's not fair. It's not a 50-50 thing. You have to go 80% of the way to win over Congress. You got to go 80% of the way. You got to keep extending the hand and keep extending the hand and keep extending the hand. So I would say there is a lack of urgency in trying to crack that code. I'm not saying this is not an easy Congress to work with. Nobody is saying that it isn't. But I think that, and look, and if you were to say one other thing that I think was that what would his relationship with Congress be had he gotten elected president with only 54 senators instead of 59? I have always wondered that. And the reason I say is because then all of a sudden, what if in his first year, he actually had to reach out to Republicans to pass legislation? 6, 8, 9, rather than just the 2 or 3 that he had. What if he really had to always reach out to 8 or 10 then? Is it a different relationship that he has with Republicans today? Maybe. How about we got
one last question.
Okay, great. Who gets it? I'll be in trouble if I don't answer your question. No, you're gonna fact check me, and then I'm gonna be in trouble.
Quick question for you. Excuse me. In the same way, there's obviously noticeable tension between the State Department and the White House on the Iran negotiations. Do you see the same tension emerging over the way we handle our coalition against ISIS? For example, the issue of arming these Peshmergans, for example, or taking more of a militaristic role. Do you see that between, let's say, the Security Council and the State Department?
Well, I think we might see it when Ash Carter gets in. I think he is going to be a little more of a. When you think about it in hindsight, it was an interesting pick by the president, because I think Ash Carter is going to be a little more aggressive in wanting to be a little more forward-leaning on troops. Look, I had Richard Engel had an interview with the son of the Kurdish president that we aired on Meet the Press, and he was basically saying the U.S. could be doing more, and they're not yet. Yeah. Now, Kerry's response is, well, we've got to build up this army. We can't just do this now because, and that is sort of, and this is where I think I think the split is actually obviously between the sort of hawks on the hill and I think where the administration is. And this is, what I don't know for sure is Kerry just towing the line that he's supposed to tow on this or not, and it very well could be. I think he's usually, but the president is convinced that that all of these military incursions that they've done have always been short term. They've been successful, but there's never any. The minute you withdraw the troops, no matter when you withdraw them or no matter when you pull back, chaos ensues, and any gains that you made is gone. Right? He saw it. He believes firsthand. He's seen it in Afghanistan. Obviously, he feels like he's seeing it in Iraq. So I think that's why there is this determination, quote, not to do this for them, right? That this is you've got to, yes, we know the Kurds need more help, and maybe they could maybe they would be more efficient using our help than, say, the rest of the Iraqi military. But until you have an Iraqi military that seems stable, and I kind of think it feels to me as if, well, what's the history of this? It's never worked before. Why do you think the Iraqi military is suddenly going to be good now? I mean, we spent 10 years training this military, and they folded like a cheap suit. And now 2 more years of training them. No, this time we're going to get it right, and this time they're going to be an army that's going to be able to stand up to ISIS. So I get the president's skepticism on this, and I get sort of where their head is at, which is we're going to do just enough to help them, but it's got to be about building up their ability to do this on their own. I just don't believe they're ever going to be able to. And and this is a case where, he may be leaving. This is where the campaign's going to be interesting, because people like me are going to be asking, are you willing to put more troops to go in after ISIS, more ground troops? And it'll be interesting to see how these candidates answer that question, because they know there's going to be the fear of fatigue on one hand. But I was talking to a Republican senator today about the difficulty, whether it would be difficult or not to get this war authorization through, and he said to me, "Well, right now, no. Kayla Mueller has got everybody galvanized." So you do get these moments where the politics of intervention has changed a little bit in the country, but what it also told me is every one of them cares more about what the public wants to do on this rather than whether the policy is right or not. And so that's how we get into trouble. That's how we end up getting into trouble. And
Chuck, thank you very much
You got it, guys.
for your riveting remarks.